They say the dead leave quietly, but in Ireland, they don't. Here, the dead linger in doorways and dreams, in the wind moving across ancient fields. Not as ghosts, not as threats, but as neighbors in a world where the veil between life and death is thin enough to breathe through. Ireland did not believe the dead were gone. They believed they were close. And tonight, you'll understand why. Ireland is a land of stories, yes. But some stories seem older than the land itself. Stories of places where the world feels different. Lighter, quieter, charged with something unseen. These are the thin places. Spots where heaven, earth, and the other world overlap like mist. Where the living and the dead walk the same path only seconds apart. For the Irish, death wasn't an exit. It was a shift, a turning of the body, while the spirit stayed close enough to listen. Tonight we explore the belief that shaped Irish identity for centuries. The belief that the dead never fully leave. Chapter 1. What a thin place really is. A thin place isn't a haunted site. People imagine ghosts, shadows, things hiding in the dark. But that's not what the Irish meant at all. A thin place isn't a threat. It isn't a warning. It isn't some cursed corner of the world waiting to swallow you whole. A thin place is something far more delicate, far more ancient, far more intimate. A thin place is a doorway made of atmosphere, memory, and silence. It's a space where the world feels strangely lighter, where the air seems to hold its breath, where time softens at the edges like wet parchment. It is the kind of place where you stop speaking without knowing why, as if your voice might disturb something older than your own lifetime. It can be a cliff where the sea speaks in a language older than English, older than Ireland, older than anything human vocabulary can wrap itself around. Waves crash, but somehow they aren't just waves. They sound like stories being retold by the Atlantic. Stories carved into salt and foam long before people had alphabets. A thin place can be a bog that holds centuries like secrets, where the earth itself remembers everything. Footsteps, rituals, offerings, bodies, battles, prayers. The land doesn't just hold history, it preserves it quietly, patiently, as if guarding a truth humanity keeps forgetting. It can be a stone circle that has watched more funerals than weddings, where generations gathered to mourn, celebrate, plead, and whisper their hopes into the sky. Those stones do not speak, but somehow they know things. They have seen grief swell and fade, love bloom and collapse, villages rise and fall. And when you stand among them, you feel like a temporary visitor in a place that has no interest in being temporary. A thin place is not something you see, and it's something you feel. It announces itself in your chest, a small tightening under the ribs, a flicker in the mind, a silence that isn't empty but full. You don't look at a thin place. You sense it, the way you sense a shift in weather, or the moment someone is staring at you from behind. Irish tradition says the veil between worlds isn't a wall. It's a curtain. Light, moving, delicate, like linen hanging over an open window. And just like a curtain, it's never fully still. Sometimes it sways, restless with the breeze of something unseen. Sometimes it parts, revealing nothing you can point to, but everything your instincts recognize. A subtle shift, a presence, a closeness, and sometimes something on the other side steps close enough to be sensed. Not in a terrifying way, not in a horror movie run for your life way, but in a way that makes the small hairs on your arm rise, as if someone gently placed a hand on your shoulder from a place you cannot name. Thin places are not about fear. They are about nearness. The nearness of the past. The nearness of the dead. The nearness of something eternal pressing softly against the edges of the physical world, reminding you that the living are never truly alone, and the dead never fully leave. Chapter 2. Why the Irish never believed in gone. In the Irish worldview, death didn't erase relationships. It didn't sever bonds or silence familiar voices. To the Irish mind, death was not an ending but a transition. A shift in presence, not an absence. The people you loved didn't vanish. They simply changed the way they stood in your life. It changed them. Not into something frightening, not into something monstrous, but into something quieter, gentler, something made of memory, meaning, and proximity. They were still themselves, just living in a different kind of nearness. Ireland never had a true word for goodbye, not in the permanent, severing final sense that other languages carry. The idea of a farewell that closed a door forever didn't fit the Irish spirit because the Irish never believed the door closed in the first place. Every parting was temporary, every journey a circle, every departure understood as a pause, not an exit. Every farewell was a blessing. Slán, go safe. Beannacht, may you be blessed. These weren't dramatic or poetic inventions. They were everyday expressions woven into ordinary life. Blessings carried people forward because you never knew when they'd return. And they always returned, in one form or another. It wasn't denial, it wasn't wishful thinking, it wasn't fear of facing the pain of loss. It was understanding. A deep ancestral understanding passed down through centuries of myth, tragedy, famine, and resilience. The Irish knew that love doesn't vanish when breath does. They knew memory outlives the body, and connection outlives the heartbeat. The dead weren't lost. They weren't unreachable. They weren't drifting somewhere distant across a cosmic ocean. They weren't elsewhere. They had simply stepped beyond the physical threshold, into a space where time folds differently and presence is felt rather than seen. To the Irish, the dead were not gone. They were simply on the other side of the room. They had walked into another room of the same house of existence. And in that house, there were no locked doors. Only thin walls, soft boundaries, quiet passages where the living and the dead could still sense each other. Families set out food for the departed on certain nights, not out of superstition, but out of respect. An ancient hospitality that did not end at the grave. They believed those who had passed on might still feel hunger, not for bread or broth, but for remembrance, for warmth, for acknowledgement. Candles were placed in windows, their small flames flickering like open hands in the darkness. Light is a language older than writing, and the Irish used it as an invitation. We see you. We remember you. You are welcome here. Doors were left ajar, not because people feared spirits forcing their way in, but because they hoped their loved ones would feel comfortable enough to wander home. A slightly open door was a gesture of trust, an offering of belonging, a reminder that home does not close itself to its own. Not for ghosts, but for company. Because the dead weren't strangers. They weren't visitors, they weren't intruders. They were family. Part of the same lineage, the same blood, the same story. The dead were kin, and kin were never abandoned. Not by the living, not by the land, not by the old way of seeing the world. To the Irish, relationships woven in love do not unravel when a heartbeat stops. They continue, softly, invisibly, faithfully, just beyond the veil. Chapter 3. The Otherworld. Not heaven, not hell. While many cultures imagine the afterlife as reward or punishment, a grand sorting of souls into light or fire, Ireland imagined it as something entirely different. Not judgment, not separation, not a cosmic courtroom. Instead, the Irish saw death as a movement, a continuation of the same story, a gentle step sideways rather than a leap into the unknown. In the Irish mind, the afterlife wasn't a place where you ended up. It was a place you arrived into, still carrying your laughter, your flaws, your desires, your memories. Nothing about you had to be erased to enter it. You didn't need to earn it. You simply crossed a boundary as thin as mist. Tir na nog, mag mel, tek duin. These weren't final destinations. They weren't eternal thrones or pits of punishment. They were landscapes, soft, alive, shimmering with myth, that represented the deeper layers of existence, places where time loosened its grip, and beauty gathered in ways the living world could not contain. Tir na Nog, the land of the young, where age paused its march and joy took the shape of endless green fields, feasts and music that felt heavier than emotion, yet lighter than breath. Mag Mell, the plain of delight, a realm of peace so profound that warriors imagined it not as reward, but as a homecoming. A place where exhaustion finally softened. Tek Duin, the House of Dawn, a shadowed yet sacred gathering place where ancestors waited, watched, and guided the newly departed onward. It was not a doom-filled resting place, it was a spiritual harbor. These worlds weren't prisons for souls. They were realms of beauty, memory, and timelessness, woven into the same fabric as the living world. Not distant, not unreachable, just hidden, like ink beneath a palimpsest, always there if you knew how to read the faint marks. The veil shifted with seasons. Autumn thinned it. Winter pressed it close. Samhain tore it open like a soft seam. The land itself breathed with the otherworld, the boundaries expanding and contracting as naturally as tides. It shifted with moonlight, silvering the edges of the world, making familiar paths shimmer as if something unseen walked them moments before you did. It shifted with keening cries, those ancient mourning wails that were never just for the living. The Irish believed the dead heard them too, felt them, followed them, as if grief were a rope thrown across worlds. It shifted with music so full of ache it could dissolve reality for a moment. A single note on a fiddle, a lilting voice in an empty pub, a tune carried by wind over the coastline. These were enough to blur the borders and let the otherworld breathe through. In this worldview, the afterlife wasn't above or below. It wasn't a faraway paradise or a distant realm of judgment. It was beside you, adjacent, parallel, close enough that its presence could brush the edges of your consciousness without ever needing to appear in front of your eyes. Close, enough to brush your shoulder when the wind turned. Close enough to linger in the corner of a dream. Close enough to remind you that the divide between the living and the dead was never a chasm, only a curtain. Chapter 4. Places where the veil thins. Ireland is filled with locations people swear feel different. Not just beautiful, different. Not just historic, charged. These are places where the air seems to hum with something unseen, where your heartbeat falls into rhythm with an older pulse beneath the soil. These places do not shout their power. They whisper it, softly, persistently. Like a truth you already knew before you were born. The cliffs of Moher at dawn, when the sea breathes like a living giant. Stand there early enough and the world feels paused, as if the Atlantic itself is waiting to speak. The wind carries stories older than kingdoms, and the sun rises slowly, carefully, as though it too is aware of where it stands. People say the cliffs stretch the soul, that looking out from their edge feels less like sightseeing and more like remembering something forgotten. The Hill of Tara, where kings were crowned and spirits wandered freely. This is not just a hill, it is a crossroads of myth and memory. A place where power once mingled with ritual, and where the ground is said to hold echoes of footsteps from both the living and the dead. On Tara, the sky always feels too wide, as if the heavens sit closer to the earth, leaning in to listen. Glendalough, where mist hangs over water like a memory refusing to loosen its grip. In the early morning, the valley feels suspended between worlds. You can almost imagine ancient monks still moving silently through the trees, their prayers woven into the wind, their presence lingering like the mist itself. Water reflects more than scenery here. It reflects a world that seems half in this life, half in another. Fairy forts hidden in fields, untouched for hundreds of years because even the skeptical feel a warning in their bones. These ring forts look simple, little circles of earth and grass, but every Irish person knows better than to disturb them. Farmers plow around them. Builders avoid them. Stories say these are the ancient boundaries of the Sea, and no one wants to learn, personally, what happens when you cross a line not meant to be crossed. Thin places aren't just scenic. They're resonant, layered, alive. They sit at the intersection of myth, geography, and the quiet parts of human intuition. They make you lower your voice without knowing why, as if something unseen is listening. When you stand in them, time feels thinner, and so do you. Your worries shrink. Your sense of self loosens. You become porous. The world passing through you instead of simply around you. In a thin place, the boundary between flesh and spirit, past and present, living and departed, softens just enough to remind you. You are part of something vast, ancient, and ongoing. Chapter 5. Why the Dead Stay Close. Ireland's history is woven with grief. Threads of famine, emigration, war, and loss running through centuries of collective memory. This is a land where families were torn apart not by choice, but by hunger, by ships, by borders, by the quiet cruelty of history. Generations learned what it meant to lose people suddenly, to watch loved ones disappear into oceans, into earth, into memory. Because of this, Ireland never treated grief as a moment. It treated grief as an inheritance. Something carried, honored, tended. The belief that the dead stay close didn't emerge from fear. It didn't come from superstition or dread. It wasn't about ghosts lurking in corners or spirits refusing to pass on. It emerged from comfort, a comfort shaped by centuries of heartbreak. For the Irish, believing in closeness was easier than believing in disappearance. It felt more true, more human, more faithful to the way love actually works. Irish families remembered their dead through stories, told by firesides, over tea, in crowded kitchens, and in quiet moments when a name slipped naturally into conversation. Stories weren't recited like ritual. They were retold because the dead remained part of the family, as alive in words as they once were in flesh. Every tale kept them seated at the table. Every memory pulled them gently back into the room. They remembered through songs. Not just laments, but lively tunes, drinking songs, ballads thick with sentiment. Music was a way of speaking across worlds, a way of saying, "You're still here. We still hear you. We still carry you." And in the Irish tradition, when a song rose in a home or a pub, it wasn't sung about the dead. It was sung with them. As though each note made space for another voice, they remembered through objects. A coat folded with care, a pocket watch kept in a drawer, a rosary hung by a bed, or a letter tucked into a book. Nothing was discarded quickly. To throw something away was to break a thread, and the Irish didn't break threads lightly. They kept the belongings of the departed not out of morbid attachment, but out of recognition. Objects carry imprint. Objects remember. Birth names were repeated across generations. Sons named after grandfathers, daughters after grandmothers, middle names carried like blessings resting on new shoulders. This wasn't coincidence, it was continuation. A way of making sure the story of the dead didn't dissolve into the margins of family memory. A name spoken often as a soul kept near. Clothes were folded, not thrown away. Not because anyone expected the wearer to return, but because care itself was a form of remembrance. Folding was respect. Folding was love. Folding was saying, your presence mattered. Your absence still matters. In this worldview, the dead weren't trapped. They weren't lingering because they had unfinished business or because they feared what lay beyond. They were free. Free in a way the living can only partially understand. But freedom doesn't always mean leaving. Sometimes freedom means choosing to stay. Sometimes it means hovering at the edges of the world you loved, remaining within reach of the voices that once called your name. Sometimes freedom means watching over the generations that followed you, quietly, lovingly, like a hand resting lightly on a shoulder you cannot see. Sometimes it means staying close to the people you loved, because in the Irish imagination, love doesn't fade by crossing a threshold. It simply changes the way it touches you. Chapter 6. When the veil touches you. Every Irish family has a story of a moment when the veil felt thinner than usual. Not a dramatic haunting, not a ghostly apparition stepping out of the dark, but a small, intimate ripple in reality. Soft enough to miss, powerful enough to remember for the rest of your life. A dream that predicted a passing. These dreams were spoken of quietly, shared in kitchens over tea or whispered at wakes, never bragged about but never dismissed either. Someone would say, "I saw her last night," and everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. In Ireland, the boundary between dream and message was never completely sealed. A clock stopping at the exact second someone died. Not a coincidence, not a mechanical fault, but a moment when time itself seemed to pause out of respect for a departing soul. Irish households kept those clocks as if they had witnessed something sacred, because in a way they had. A bird tapping softly on a window after a funeral. A robin, most often. Or a blackbird. Sometimes a wren. The smallest creatures seem to carry the biggest messages, arriving with the quiet confidence of something that knows it has been sent. People didn't scream or run. They simply opened the window and said hello. A scent, turf smoke, lavender, tobacco, appearing without source. These scents drifted through rooms like invisible footsteps. Gentle, familiar, unmistakable. A husband's pipe, a grandmother's perfume, the smell of a fireside from a childhood home long gone. They came not to frighten, but to comfort, as if breath itself were remembering someone aloud. These weren't superstitions. Superstitions are rooted in fear. These moments were rooted in knowing. They were signs. Not warnings, not omens, but reminders. Small gestures across the divide that said, "I'm still here." Presence does not depend on flesh. The Irish never needed a body to feel someone close. The warmth of memory, the familiar shift in the air, the sudden sense that you are not alone. These were forms of presence just as valid as footsteps or fingerprints. Love does not disappear. It changes temperature. It changes language. It changes the way it touches you. But it does not vanish, not in Ireland, not in the places where connection is treated as eternal. And death is not the end of proximity. It's simply a change in the way distance works, a shift from physical closeness to something more diffuse, more subtle but no less real. Thin places are not always landscapes. They are not always cliffs or valleys or ancient rings of stone. Sometimes they're moments, fleeting, fragile, impossible to explain, yet impossible to dismiss. Sometimes they're grief cracked open, a moment when sorrow becomes so wide, so raw, so honest, that the veil has no choice but to loosen and let something through. Sometimes they're the quiet between two breaths when the world feels full of someone you thought you lost. A stillness heavy with presence, a softness full of meaning, a silence that says more than any voice ever could. In those moments, the veil doesn't just thin, it touches you. And once it does, you never see distance, death, or absence the same way again. So why did Ireland believe the dead never fully leave? Because absence here is never silent. Grief is never empty. And the border between now and forever has always been soft, honest, and more like a whisper than a barrier. The dead don't vanish. They circle, they watch, they visit, they protect. And in the thin places, they stand beside you long enough to let you know you were never walking alone. If this journey into Ireland's thin places moved something in you, subscribe for more stories shaped by myth, mystery, and the quiet magic of the night. Leave a comment telling me your own thin place, or a moment when the world felt thinner than usual. And until our next whisper in the dark, mind the veil and walk gently.